We're from Fancy Techo Crafts.
And we're going to show you how to get your craft on. To sew a flat felled seam, you're going to start by sewing a seam at your regular seam allowance, but you're going to put your wrong sides together. So the right side of your fabric is facing out. And I'm going to sew a 5/8 inch seam allowance here. Once you've sewn that first seam, you're going to trim one of the seam allowances down to 1/8 of an inch. The flat felled seam is going to sit on one side of your original seam. So the side that you want the flat felled seam to lean to is the side that you're going to trim your seam allowance on. So I'm going to trim this to 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to do it this way. Make sure you're only trimming one side of that seam allowance. Once you've trimmed that seam, you're going to press both of your seam allowances away from the trimmed seam. And then give that a second to cool off. And then you're going to fold the wider seam allowance over top of the narrow seam allowance and press that down. You don't want to go past the original seam though. Make sure you're on the seam allowance side with your raw edge. Then you're going to flip that seam allowance that has the fold in it now and that's wrapped around that smaller 1/8 inch seam allowance and press it down to fully encase the raw edges. And then all that's left is to stitch down your fold. To finish the flat felled seam, we're going to now secure the folded seam allowance here by stitching right along that edge, along that folded edge. So I'm just bringing my needle down to check the placement of the needle, and it's very close to the folded edge, so I'm just going to sew slowly so that I can keep it in the same place the full way down the flat felled seam. And there's a finished flat felled seam.